You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun. It could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Inslee.
This is episode 351 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I'm talking about weapons, U.S. selling weapons to different countries, Russia selling weapons to Turkey, and then looking at the picture of global nuclear weapons. I got updates on the siege of the Venezuelan embassy in D.C., and then I think the most important topic right now, which is Iran, and at least elements of the Trump administration really pushing the U.S. down a road that could very easily lead to a conflict there. All right, guys, please take the time to share the show or recommend it to a friend. Best place to find the show online is at the Libertarian Institute, where my show and daily news roundup are featured in the right-hand column on the homepage. And then there's just a ton of other great libertarian content up there. Of course, Scott Horton is on the blog all day long, and that's where you find the Scott Horton Show as well. If you're listening to the show and you enjoy it, make sure you subscribe to the show somewhere. Most of what I do on the show is updating current events. So if you're subscribed to the show and listening to every episode, you're going to get the most out of it and have the deepest understanding of what's going on with U.S. foreign policy. And then if you really like the show, make sure you're donating to it at patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. All right, up first, weapons. In the U.S., we have a situation where Google has started some kind of fund to fund different venture capitalists, companies doing tech things. And one of these companies is apparently helping the Pentagon develop targeting AI for drones. Now, I've talked about this on the past on the show and related to Google's Project Maven, which was shut down after a lot of Google employees came out against it. And I think it was that and then the public awareness of the project, which again, Google helping the Pentagon with their drones, drove Google to say they wouldn't renew that contract with the Pentagon. Now, for now, my understanding of this is it just could be so happens to be a Google-funded company that they didn't actually consider this as something to replace the Project Maven, or it's possible that that's exactly what it is. And hopefully we'll have some more journalism and stuff coming out on this, explaining exactly what these different U.S. companies are contracting with the Pentagon to develop. And of course, another important issue here is that it's our tax dollars going into it. And so if the projects are completely secret, we have no idea if they're a success or not, and it could just be wasting our money. But the other problem with the secrecy is that these projects could be used to, say, spy on American civilians, or even, develop technologies that, as AI, they could, well, I guess as any weapon could be turned against the American people by the American government, or potentially kill Americans overseas. So there could be real problems with developing this technology, and it's important that this stuff is understood by the public as to what's going on, and we really do keep tabs on how far Pentagon is going down with contracting with these tech companies and developing AI targeting software. And that's another good point is that if companies like Google, Facebook, Twitter, whatever else become dependent on contracts from the Pentagon, then they're more likely, I think, to take positions of the U.S. government. So, I think a pretty easy example, actually, and there's a great episode of the Scott Horton Show where he interviews one of the writers from the Institute about some U.S. laws regarding the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. That's, a Palestinian rights movement that says, hey, the Israeli state has become an apartheid state against the Palestinians, and so we need to advocate for, boycotting Israel, divesting, people's investments from Israel, and then sanctioning that country. Now, I have problems with the sanctioning, of course, but the boycotting and divestments, if that's what you want to do, then you can. And I certainly, if it's something directly from the Israeli state, then, no question to me, go ahead and boycott that and, try to get all U.S. foreign aid cut from that thing. So if, say the U.S. government passes a law that says that its contractors can't support the BDS movement, then it prevents any of these, companies from becoming supportive of this movement just because, they're now getting billions of dollars in Pentagon contracts. And so it's a real way, I think, that the U.S. government could enforce social policy on the large U.S. companies in a negative way. And also, again, oppress the American people with the companies here. The State Department announced it had approved weapon sales to 3 countries, Canada, Japan, and South Korea. These 3 sales in total are $1 billion, and they're all Raytheon-made missiles of some kind. Of course, the Congress, or I believe the Senate, could take up these weapon sales within 30 days and try to ride it and say, no, we're not going to sell these weapons, but I guarantee you that's not going to happen. Just to break this down real quick, Canada is receiving, I believe, somewhere in around 50 conversion upgrade kits for torpedoes, and this cost around $400 million. South Korea and Japan made purchases of, I believe, sea-to-land missiles produced by Raytheon. South Korea is acquiring about 100 plus about 12 radar systems for those missiles, and Japan is making a purchase of similar size. These each cost just over $300 million. Kind of on the geopolitics end of this, the sale to Canada doesn't strike me as being anything that's really going to stir any pots or cause any trouble. The U.S. has this very close relationship with Canada, right next door neighbor. However, with selling these weapons to Japan or South Korea, China or North Korea could perceive that as threats and have some geopolitical repercussions there. If nothing else, it just, kind of adds to this whole military industrial complex, and this will allow Raytheon to buy another representative to pass another law that is either, a more hawkish foreign policy or generally promotes a larger, more robust military and thus generating more money for Raytheon. So Turkey made a statement that I found very interesting, and so far I don't have a lot of details on, so I can really only just bring you the headline here. And that is, Turkey says they will purchase the S-400 missile system and the S-500 missile system from Russia. Now, these are air defense systems, and from my understanding aren't naturally offensive weapons, and so maybe they could be converted like the U.S. Patriot missile systems, but generally these are missile defense either to shoot down planes with the S-400, and I guess those could probably intercept missiles too, but I think the S-500 system is kind of the better missile defense system. Now, the reason this is a big deal and not just why is this even matter? Why is Kyle talking about it on the show? The U.S. and Turkey are both members of NATO, and the U.S. has an agreement with Turkey to make them not only recipients of the F-35, America's 5th generation fighter aircraft, stealth fighter aircraft, but also Turkey is part of that production process, I think making parts of the seats and landing gear. Well, when Turkey announced they're buying the S-400 missile system, the U.S. says, well, you can't have the S-400 and the F-35. The S-400 being Russian-made, they believe that with its radar systems and everything like that, it would make the F-35 more vulnerable and less stealth on the Russian systems. And that would also create a problem because Turkey couldn't tie their air defense systems in with the rest of NATO's. And so we've been complaining that this is a strategic problem. Now, from my understanding of the situation, there is actually some strategic problem here. This isn't just a case that I believe Lockheed, who makes a lot of the missile defense systems, feel left out and are looking for the U.S. to apply political pressure on Turkey to buy their systems so they get to make the money rather than Russia. But the way the stealth systems and the radars work right now, if, the Russians would have access to the data from the Turkish radar systems and they're flying F-35s around, then it would make it a lot easier for Russia to figure out what kind of whatever small radar signatures the F-35s give off. I've read that Turkey is supposed to take hold of the S-400 system this summer, actually delivered to Turkey is what this means, not necessarily deployed. I'm sure it will be several months of training before Turkey actually announces that, hey, we have these systems operational for our use. The U.S. has threatened sanctions and just about everything else to keep Turkey from buying the S-400 system. Saying they're buying the S-500 too is just, it seems to me to be another step towards, saying that they're serious about it. Now, there's been some speculation all along that this is some kind of bluff by Turkey, looking to pressure the United States into maybe supporting the Kurds less in Syria or something like that. But here we are, we're really getting down to the delivery date, and it seems like Turkey still plans to go ahead with that buy. All right, there's this article in Newts that appeared in Defense One, and I'll link to in the show notes page. But basically what it does is it looks at the situation around the world with, mostly the U.S., Russia, and China, and their nuclear arsenals and how they're becoming less predictable. There's some particular kind of weapons developments that they point to here. One is the low yield weapons that I believe both the US, Russia, and maybe even China possess now. These are what have been called tactical warheads, meaning we're not going to blow up a city with them. We're going to blow up a, army division or battalion or something like that coming over the hill. So it's, really crazy and stupid to think that you're going to just, tactically use nuclear warheads because, these are giant explosions. But at the same time, nuclear planners are pretty crazy people, I guess, and this is the dream that they've dreamed up. Now, of course, one of the reasons that these weapons are more unpredictable and more dangerous than a larger nuclear warhead is that you may have somebody like Trump or any president, potentially, it's a lower threshold of use. Well, I'm not going to use the big bomb. That's the big option. That's the one I absolutely can't go for. But using the smaller nuclear warhead, I send the nuclear message, but at the same time, it's not a hydrogen bomb. Then there's also the issue that these smaller warheads, I believe, are loaded onto smaller missiles. And so if, let's say, the U.S. is in a situation where we're in some kind of hot conflict or near hot conflict with Russia, and we're capable of loading some kind of nuclear weapons onto cruise missiles, then that means every time the U.S. shoots a cruise missile, Russia has to evaluate whether that's a nuclear weapon coming at them or not. And a lot more unpredictability. I also should say here that I believe in these cases, Russia is possessing a similar arsenal, and so it could be the opposite, where the Russians have the cruise missile they fire and the U.S. has to make this assessment. There's also the new hypersonic missiles that Russia possesses, and one of the, key abilities of these missiles is with the ICBMs we have now. I think pretty early on in the flight path of these missiles, it's easy to determine where they're headed, just based on, all the simulations that they've been able to run, data they've been able to collect, and the ability with the current ICBMs. And so if a missile is coming at the United States, it's pretty easy to pit that up and then set up missile defense to take it out. Now, I guess it's still pretty complicated, but we have some knowledge of what that is. Now, with the new hypersonic missiles, I guess they could kind of hit any target within the U.S., and you're able to, kind of throw all that good information that you had out the window about predictability of what, a nuclear missile may be aimed at. Now, right now, I believe Russia only has those hypersonic missiles. However, the U.S. is working on our own development of those missiles. However, who knows what, the U.S. military industrial complex, and it's very corrupt and incapable stage right now. Look at the Zumwalt ships or the F-35 can produce as far as this goes. This article also assesses that China could be a real problem here because China possesses, I think, kind of a nuclear threat towards Russia, but at the same time doesn't possess a major nuclear arsenal. I think their number is below 300 nukes at this point. And then there's also their situation with India. And so they don't want to enter into major arms control agreements with Russia and the United States, who have much larger arsenals. However, this prevents Russia from extending more into them. I'm not sure how much that argument holds up. I thought it was an interesting part of that piece, which again will be linked to in the show notes page. All right, getting on to other stuff here. The U.S. sanctioned, I believe, about 10 Mexicans and Mexican businesses. One of those sanctioned was a Mexican judge. These people are all alleged to have taken bribes or helped in the drug trafficking for the Mexican cartels to the United States. Didn't see any evidence. I can't evaluate it. Of course, we know that there's a major drug trafficking market that heads through Mexico because of the U.S. war on drugs. All right, so the Venezuelan embassy in the U.S., for at least a few weeks now, there's been several protesters who have been, I think their choice of words, occupy, not what I would have used. They have been the invited guests of the Maduro government in Venezuela, who, is the Venezuelan government, to stay in the Venezuelan embassy in D.C. because all the Venezuelans were forced to leave by the U.S. government. So you have Americans in there. I think Kevin Zeese was in there for a while, and they were at some point then kind of under siege by the supporters of Juan Guaido, the guy trying to pull off a coup in Venezuela, and who is supported by the U.S. government. So it seems to me that this story goes a couple weeks of insults hurled and, potentially trying to keep food or supplies out of the Venezuelan embassy before the Secret Service finally comes in and, arrests them and evicts them out of that Venezuelan embassy. I'm assuming that whoever Guaido has appointed to be ambassador to the U.S. is now kind of residing in that post. Now, I guess it was probably unrealistic to expect that these people are going to be able to stay in the embassy long enough for U.S. tensions with Venezuela to have thawed. But I do think this was pretty effective protesting. And, as a libertarian on this one, I got handed to, kind of the leftists that I think took up this cause and did a really good job of flying banners and kind of, using the siege of them in the Venezuelan embassy to explain the point and explain why we can't go to war with Venezuela and how terrible that would be. Now, obviously, the State Department didn't get the memo. A State Department official said that what they're working on right now is trying to force Russia and Cuba out of Venezuela. I'm not sure if this is something that the Trump government actually believes or just something they're kind of trying to put out in the press to justify continuing this regime change effort. That all we had to do now is get Russia and Cuba out because then Maduro will fall. That's really all that's propping him up. I don't think this is true. Every time the U.S. tries a coup attempt, more Venezuelans turn up in the street supporting Maduro. His poll numbers go up. And so I think this is a combination of any U.S. action in Venezuela is unpopular, and Maduro still has a lot of popular support in that country, far more than Guaido, who was unknown when he declared himself president. All right, I got a story on Ukraine here. This is a country with a parliament and a president. The president is elected, I think, by a popular vote of the people. And then the parliament, is elected to seats at different times, and they form ruling coalitions within the parliament. So the recent presidential election elected the least pro-EU and NATO candidate, although you can't really say that he's not at least sympathetic to that side from the statements that I've heard. And this guy's name is Zelensky. He's the former actor. And so he's president-elect. And then you have the parliament. And apparently the ruling coalition of the parliament has now fallen apart, which gives them 30 days to form a new coalition, or it will allow Zelensky to call for new elections. And then the thought there is that this will let the parliament more tied with his beliefs, allowing him to push forward more of his agenda. I honestly can't say I understand Ukrainian politics well enough to know what the whole strategy is here. I just want to update that's what's going on. On to Iran stuff. A report surfaced that Trump does not want war with Iran, and this is what he's telling his top aides. So, good sign if that's actually what's coming out. He's also tweeting some things, including threats. I think pretty similar to what North Korea and what was going on there. So, who knows? Maybe next week he's in love with the Ayatollah. But for now, the situation still seems pretty tense, but behind the scenes, it does seem like there's probably some more reason than what we're actually getting, especially since we're hearing a lot from the John Bolton and Mike Pompeo camps. I'm going to link in the show notes page to an interview of the Scott Horton Show with Mohammed Sahimi, who just does an excellent job of kind of breaking down what U.S. and Iranian relations are and how they got there. So if you want it in depth, it's about an hour long, but it's definitely worth listening to. Check out that. I want to kind of just take it on the show from the perspective that I've read from Ray McGovern, Gareth Porter, Patrick Coburn, and that is the tensions with Iran are really bad right now. So any kind of, event, whether it's the Houthis blowing up the Riyadh airport or hitting a pipeline with a drone or somebody damaging boats in a UAE port, any of these things could trigger what Kurt Mills explains would be like probably a Syria style strike. And this is what I've kind of estimated on my show in the past as making some sense as what Trump would go along with, thinking that the U.S. could basically just bomb 100 Iranian IRGC targets, couple hundred airstrikes, and then, no more war after that. And we showed those dastardly Persians not to mess with us. Some signs that this is, continuing to go in the wrong direction. The FAA issued a statement telling commercial airliners to avoid the Gulf and the Gulf of Oman, this territory right around Iran, as, potentially becoming militarized. Bahrain ordered its citizens to return from Iran and Iraq in fear of a war breaking out there. Couple energy companies removed some employees from an oil field out of fears that, that oil field could potentially be targeted for attack. And the State Department removed some personnel from some Iraqi embassies. Even if this is all for show, there's an awful lot of show going on. And, that means somebody, I think, is trying to start a fire here. That's likely, kind of Israeli, Saudi, Emirati, and then the neocon and Bolton-like interests in the United States who just have long wanted this war with Iran for whatever bloodthirsty reasons. The IAEA continues to say that Iran is doing what they need to do for the nuclear deal. There's some controversy here now as Iran, I think, walked the idea of increasing their enrichment of uranium to medical grade, which is still far short of weapons grade, but I think is around 20%, where fuel grade I think is much lower at like 3%. However, this is apparently something that Iran is permitted to do within the nuclear agreement if another country leaves, which the U.S. has. And so while I'm guessing we'll hear the Hawks say, well, now Iran's violating the deal, no, that isn't the case. And the international UN agency that's tasked with enforcing the agreement are, I guess, kind of saying if it's being upheld or not, is saying that no, Iran is still good on it. Last up here, a couple events in Israel. One, we have Palestinian refugee camp in Syria bombed. I believe this was rocket fire from Al-Qaeda. And then we had reports on Friday and Saturday night of Israeli missile defense intercepting some kind of projectiles fired from Israeli-held territory, they say. I'm assuming this means the Golan Heights, although I didn't see any confirmation from any other source other than Syrian state media that this has happened. All right, guys, I hope you're enjoying the show. I know I've been talking a lot of Iran lately, but I think it's really important. Bolton, Pompeo, Trump in the White House, dangerous times. So make sure that you're sharing the show to get the word out on, what's actually going on. If people understand the relationship between the U.S. and Iran, I think they're much less likely to want war between the two countries. Also, if you talk to them about kind of the logistical problems about going to war with Iran, that's a big help too. foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, libertarianinstitute.org, immersionnews.com, at KYAAALE on Twitter.